Welcome to Chronicles of Old Singapore. This is Dr. Loh Kah Seng, the people's historian. And in this part of the channel, I talk about my own research on the social history of Singapore and the little stories of the Lion City. Do like the video and subscribe for future episodes. This will help the channel a lot. In the last episode, if you remember, we talked about the Bukit fire as the biggest fire in Singapore history, right? And what we're going to do today is to have a follow up, which really provides the context for the fire so that we can understand the historical impact. On Singapore's subsequent history and development as a nation, as a public housing nation in particular. And this episode is therefore known as Black Areas, Singapore's urban kampongs, because that's what the perspective was of the kampongs in Singapore after the Second World War. They were seen as black areas. They were not seen as places, that people are nostalgic over today. They are not seen as places of community. They're not seen as places of close relationships and between neighbors, like we often think of today. They were seen as black areas, right? So in this episode, I'm going to be talking about what are black areas and how this helps us to understand the history of the Bukit Ho Swee fire. So to the authorities, the urban kampongs like Bukit Ho Swee were seen as undesirable and dangerous, right? The HDB in 1967 talked about the urban kampongs as breeding grounds for crime and gangsterism. In my study, right? So this is true. There was crime in the kampongs of some kind, and there was also gangsterism in the form of secret societies. But this is only one facet of what the kampongs were. The kampongs, I think, were also places of community and hope, right? So what I want to do is to kind of unpack this myth about the urban kampongs as just black areas. A good starting point is to see the kind of people that were living in the kampongs in those days. And I would say that the urban kampongs were really like children's kampongs, right? Because they were filled with children, right? They were filled with very young children and also youths, right? So this is a big contrast, right? If you go to some of the other kampongs or settlements in Southeast Asia, you find generally there's a lot of young people around, right? Even today. And this is very different from the HDB estates today. In the HDB estates today, we don't see a lot of children running around, partly because there are fewer children, and also partly because the children who are around, who are living in the estates, tend to stay indoors, right? But the urban kampongs were very different after the Second World War. There were lots of young children and youths, and they were just hanging around outside, in the streets and housing areas. So the photo there, fantastic photo, which really shows what I'm talking about. This was a kampong of children and youths. So the population of the kampongs was generally very young. Of course, there were adults taking care of them, right? Their parents and relatives. But the aging population thing that we have today, hasn't really happened yet. Why were there so many children? Obviously, someone was creating them. So from 1944 onwards, near the end of the Japanese occupation, people began to, relax a little bit, and they began to have children after, because of the war and the Japanese occupation. They were not very confident about having children. So this created what we know today as the generation of the pioneers and the Merdeka people, right? The generation of the baby boomers. So in terms of housing, this created a new problem because people historically used to live in the cubicles of Chinatown. And if your family is small, or if you're a single man, you could live in the cubicles, and just tolerate the cramped conditions. But if you have 2, 3, 4, 5 children, you could not do so, right? So people began to migrate out of Chinatown into the urban kampongs. So I showed this map, the previous talk. People used to live in A and B, which is the uh, kind of the town of Singapore, the inner city of Singapore. So A is the area south of the Singapore River, we usually call Chinatown or Ta Po, and B is the area to the north along North Bridge Road. So A is South Bridge Road, B is North Bridge Road, and so B is generally known as Little Town or Xiao Po. So Bukit Ho Swee is number 5 here, and it's one of the places just outside the town area. And you can see that people were generally moving out, right, from the 1930s and especially after the war, moving out from the town area to these kampongs. They were kind of moving out along the main roads out of the town area, right? So they move in different directions, and some of these kampongs were quite different from each other, right, as a result of the distance and the environment, right? So those they are very close to the town, like Bukit Ho Swee, Tiong Bahru, sort of to the slightly to the west. All this area here, they were still very tightly packed together, very urban, right? And those that are more to the okay. So if you go back to the east, right, you have Geylang Road and the Geylang Lorongs over here, and these kampongs were very similar to the ones in Tiong Bahru, right, and Bukit Ho Swee, because the Geylang area, the Geylang Lorong areas was also quite urbanized in those days. And actually a lot of serious fires broke out over there as well. Of course, the further east you go, to the Eunos area, to Changi, then uh, the kampongs became more rural, right? They were not so closely packed together, and they were spread further apart. The houses were spread further apart. And similarly, you have Paya Lebar area, Lorong Tai Seng, and you have got a lot of kampongs over there as well. And places like Toa Payoh, right? So Toa Payoh was within the city of Singapore. This is a map of Singapore. I should have said this earlier. This is a map of Singapore in the 1950s. And so the city of Singapore is quite a huge area, right? And the majority of Singapore's population live in this area. So Toa Payoh, Balestier, Whitley, Bukit Timah were all part of the city area. You see Thomson Village is just inside the city area as well. And then to the west, further to the west, you have Queenstown, which was the first new town that the British were building and which the PAP government finished subsequently. And so there are lots of urban kampongs in Singapore filled with all these young children and people trying to make a living. So what were the urban kampongs in terms of their environment, right? The housing was obviously very suitable because it was the houses were cheap, but it was cheap for a reason, right? It was cheap because the quality, they were made of wood, zinc, and adap. The quality was very poor, and the houses were built very quickly without much without any regulation actually, and they had no amenities, right? The material was temporary, right? So after a few years, you find that the houses began to degrade, right? And then you have to repair or you have to rebuild a new house. There were no fire breaks. The houses were built very close together, and this was very dangerous, right? Because if the houses are close together, then there's a real chance that if there's a fire, then the fire can spread to other houses. One of the funny things I think about the houses was that the house numbers, there were house numbers for many of these houses, not all, but the house numbers were not in order, right? So if the postman wanted to go to a kampong to deliver a letter, they would have a bit of trouble trying to find the right house. And another funny thing that one of my interviewees told me, Lee Su-seong, he said something about the lighting, the lights, because the kampong houses had no lighting that we have today, no electrical lighting. They use kerosene lamps or oil lamps or candles even sometimes at night. He said kampong lighting, is not like HDB house lighting, right? Why do you need such bright lights that you have today? It was crazy, right? So the kind of the visual experience of living in a kampong house is very different from living in a HDB flat. So this is a very typical example of a kampong house. The roof is made of atap. It doesn't look like it's been maintained properly. It looks like soil or mud, and there's a canal, right? A small stream of water right in front here, and a makeshift bridge. And the water, look at the water. It doesn't look like it's flowing, right? So the water seems to be stagnant, and that means what? Mosquitoes. That means whatever waste is in the water is polluting, rotting. And so this is not a very wholesome environment to live in, and the authorities were rightly very concerned about the sanitation and the risk of spread of disease. Now, the urban kampongs, they were not well built, they were insanitary, but they were also very popular, right? As I said in the last episode. So in the 1950s, what we find is that the kampongs were locked in this struggle for land, for housing, with the more suitable, the more modern public housing that was being built. The kampongs unfortunately stood on prime land for housing. So if you think of areas like Bukit Ho Swee and Tiong Bahru, and even places like Kallang, you find that this is very good land for development, right? This is excellent land for public housing. And we have public housing in Tiong Bahru and in Bukit Ho Swee today, and in Kallang, MacPherson, Toa Payoh. You have to remove them. But you cannot remove them, right? Because the people are living there. And if you remove them, you evict them en masse, then it creates an uproar, right? Which we're going to talk about in the next episode. One thing I would like to stress is that the residents of the kampongs were not squatters. Right? I know the title of my book was Squatters into Citizens. But the people living in the kampong were not squatters because they paid rent. I have never heard of a kampong person or kampong family that did not pay rent. A squatter is someone who just squats on the land and does not pay the landowner any rent, right? So this is not true. But the authorities often likened the residents of the kampongs to squatters. They treated them as squatters, right? And of course, to be squatting is to carry out a criminal act. So if you call someone a squatter, then you criminalize them, right? And you therefore take away the legitimacy that they have to be living on such land. Now, the reality was that in the 1950s, the authorities, whether it's the public state agencies or the landowners who privately own the land, they had land, but their land was idle, it was vacant, and it was not being developed. So they would lease out this land on temporary occupation licenses, what we call TOLs, right, and tenancy agreements. So this allowed people to come in and occupy the land and build housing on it. So the housing was illegal, but the ability to make use of the land, to live on the land, was not illegal actually. But they created a problem, right, for the HDB. If the HDB wanted to build public housing on this land, they could not evict the residents because there was no land. There was no place for these residents to move to, and this would probably have created a big problem for the government. If you look at the Bukit Ho Swee area, you can see this battle for land very clearly, right? So south of Bukit Ho Swee was Tiong Bahru, or what they call Si Ka Teng, and to the sort of the northeast across the Havelock Road was Hong Ling Pasat, or what in English is called Covent Garden. It's a very nice name, right? But the Covent Garden was actually an urban kampong, very much like Bukit Ho Swee, and it was seen as also a very notorious area. So there are three kampongs in this area, and Kampong Bukit Ho Swee was actually made up of Bill Lane and Kampong Bukit Ho Swee and Okyo Tau, Havelock Road, as we said in the last episode. But there were also competing forms of housing in the form of SIT estates and private estates nearby, right? So the SIT had built the famous Tiong Bahru flats, many of which are still around today. Some were built pre-war and some were built post-war, right? They were quite different, but they were all built by the SIT. The SIT was the Singapore Improvement Trust, and this was an agency that was set up by the British before the HDB was established in 1960. And the role of the SIT was to clean up the town, right? But eventually it was told to build public housing for the people. There were also housing estates in Delta, in Henderson, and Bukit Merah. So there was hardly any vacant land or idle land left over, right? So if the SIT or the HDB wanted to build more public housing in the area of Bukit Ho Swee, then there was no land, right? The land that was available was occupied by the urban kampongs, and people were already living in large numbers in these kampongs. So the estates were superior to the kampongs. They had proper amenities. They had toilets, flush toilets, pipe water, electricity. They were safe from fire, and they were built with fairly good material. SIT housing, like you see those in Tiong Bahru, right, were very well built, right? So they were built. The materials were far superior to the wood, the zinc, and the atap. But they were also too expensive. So economically and financially, they were not feasible for the general population. Now, there are two aspects of life in Bukit Ho Swee which are quite interesting, and they showed how people were actually not passive or inert, but they were trying to make the best out of a not very good situation. So one was the pigs, right? So here is an example, okay? So you can see here in front, in the center here, there's a toilet. There's a very basic toilet, a very makeshift toilet, but very typical in those days. And next to the toilet is a little pig. What's the little pig doing here? The pig is not kept in a sty, right? So it is free roaming, and it's roamed obviously to the toilet because there was food in the toilet, right? So a lot of my interviewees have talked about when they were doing their business in the toilet, the pig would be urging them, hurry up with their grunts, right? So that they can take over, right, when the person has finished their business. So pigs. The other thing besides the pigs were the graves, right? Tiong Bahru is, of course, Tiong is a cemetery, and Tiong Bahru means new cemetery. And there was also another cemetery in Bukit Ho Swee known as Macau Tiong, which was a Cantonese Hakka cemetery, no longer in use, right? But the graves are still there. And over Bio Lane and Bukit Ho Swee itself on the hill was more graves, right? These were also disused cemeteries, right? Because when the population of Singapore was much smaller, these were all vacant land, right? And the Chinese people would bury the dead on the hill. So that's something the British never understood, right? Like why the Chinese people like to stay in the shop houses in the valley area in Chinatown, in the Low area, right? While the people who are dead, right, they are placed on the hill, right, in a hilly area. But of course, this was the Chinese system of feng shui, which the British couldn't quite understand. So the people of Bukit Ho Swee were actually living with many dead people, in the soil underneath them. And the houses were often built over the grave, right? So my interviewees have talked about, like under their bed, right, was actually a tombstone or a grave stone, and they were not afraid, right? Lee Su Seong told me living people and dead people were neighbors. We didn't feel afraid. They had gotten used to it. The other thing about the kampongs were they were filled with secret societies, and this is the source of the sort of the danger, right? So to some extent, the secret societies were kind of dangerous, right? They were criminal, but there's also another aspect to it as well, right? So my interviews told me that there were many secret societies in Bukit Ho Swee and nearby, like the 08, the 18, the 24, and the 36, right? Many of these add up to 9, right? Tia Chuan, whom I interviewed, he used to be a hawker, and then he became, I think, the president of the Hawker Association. He said Bukit Ho Swee was the world of the 24. But what is a secret society in those days, right? To many residents, the secret society is a misnomer. The word is a misnomer because the people in the secret societies were not secret. They were secret to the police and the state, but they were not secret to the people living in the kampongs. They knew who they were. Sometimes they were their former classmates, sometimes they were their neighbors. And the secret societies would often, the members would often sit around in a coffee shop, right? So, like Bukit Swee, there's a coffee shop like at the entrance, right? If you wanted to go into Bukit Swee and you were a stranger, they will ask you, who are you? You know, so why do they do this, right? This is almost like a condo. You got to sign in, you got to identify who you were and what you were doing in a condo today. So this tells us that the secret societies had a social function in the kampong, right? And this is something we should see in context. In Singapore, in the colonial days, the police was not very popular in the kampongs, and they were seldom seen in the kampongs. They do not come to the kampongs. People therefore generally distrusted the police, right? So if the police came to the kampong, if there was a gang fight, for example, people would usually reply, "Wam zai," right? I don't know, right? So they did not trust the police. So this has changed a lot, obviously. Right now we have the neighborhood police, which has very good relationships with the people in general. And now, if we have a problem, the first people we would call is the police, right? Whether it's a big matter or a small matter, we just call the police. But in those days, it was very different, right? The relationship between the people and the police was generally very poor. So therefore, secret societies perform the role of the police by default. And one of my interviewee told me that gangsters, the Pai Kia or the Samseng, were actually quite good natured, right? They are 本性是不坏的. Now, I have to say that the secret society is not something we should romanticize like in the Hong Kong movies, right? They were certainly illegal. They were sometimes violent. They carry out violent acts like gang fights, fighting over turfs, and sometimes they will beat up people when they try to extort money. And therefore, they were not a desirable influence that we want to have in a community. Now, the other thing I want to say about the people living in a kampong was that they were not inert or passive or idle, or they were not lazy, right? These were the things that the PAP government wanted to deal with, when they got elected into office, because they worked, right? The people living in the kampongs worked, and they worked hard because the work was often very hard. What did they work as? They work as casual hawkers, even the children, right? Sometimes they would just go out and sell stuff. They work in the coffee shops. They work in small factories and warehouses that were part of the economy of Singapore in those days. There was no industrial economy yet. There was no manufacturing yet on a large scale, right? The MNCs had not come to Singapore yet. They work as laborers. Some of you would have heard of pirate taxis, which are the predecessors of today's private hire riding. And so they would drive these illegal pirate taxis. Work was generally casual, seasonal, piece rated, home based, manual, often unregulated or illegal, and often low paying. The wages or the pay was pretty poor. So many people were underemployed. Some people were unemployed, but many people were underemployed, right? They did not work fully to the best of their ability or to the full wages that they could have received. Children also had to do some of the work to make up for the lack of work, right? So the children would often rear poultry and help grow vegetables, helping their family and their parents. Now, I want to talk about the community and the community spirit in the urban kampongs, right? We often associate community and gotong royong and self-help with the kampongs, and this was also true of many of the urban kampongs, including Bukit Swee. Now, this community spirit grew out of a need, right? The needs of the people, right, to survive and cope with the lack of services and with the hazards and risks that they faced. Bukit Swee was very much a neglected kampong. Until the late 1950s, the colonial government did not provide any of these essential services: pipe water, fire hydrants, electricity, flush toilets, and proper roads. proper roads is very important, as I said in the last talk, right? That if you don't have proper roads, the fire engines cannot get inside the interior of the kampong. And if we look more generally, there was a reason. It was deliberate not to provide these essential services to the kampongs, right? Because in the 1958 master plan for the development of Singapore over 20 years, right, the planners had decided that the urban kampongs were a necessary evil and they were all to be demolished eventually. And the priority was to build public housing, to build proper modern housing, which I'll be talking about in subsequent episodes. So without these services and without these amenities, the kampong tried to do the best. And therefore, out of this need to survive, the people in the kampong formed a community to help each other. And this is something we call self-help, right? So one of the examples of self-help and community was celebrating the big events of the Chinese calendar, right? Because most people living in the kampong were Chinese. And so one of the big events was the Hungry Ghost Festival, and where a lot of offerings would be burned, a lot of food would be prepared by the wealthier people in the kampongs, right? And they would give out food and attract the children and the poorer people to come to the festival and come together to celebrate this festival and also get free food and things like that. The community also organized something called a hui, right? And I think the older people will know this. These are tontines, right? This is the English word, right? But the Chinese word is the hui. And this is a form of savings, right? So people will contribute a part of their savings and income to this fund, right? And if they need money, they can bid for the fund to, if they had a crisis, right? They need money. So they have something to fall back upon. It's a form of CPF among the people, right? A private CPF, if you will. But probably the most important example of community self-help was the Kampong firefighting squads, because this has got to do with the fire, right? Which is our topic here. The first firefighting squad was formed in 1958 after the disaster at Kampong Kuchai, which was burned down by fire, right? And I'll talk about this fire in a subsequent episode as well. So each of this squad, right, they had some basic training. There were about 20 or more men in one squad. They had some training from the fire service, and they had some basic equipment, right? Some like 10 buckets, for water, 6 small fire extinguishers, cannot put out a big fire, but extinguish a small one, and 2 attack hooks with pole handles to pull down the roof that was burning, right? And these were all completely voluntary, right? The men and the youths who made up these squads, right? They were not paid anything. They were there to protect their kampong from fire. And so the urban kampongs had, all these squads. And in Bukit Ho Swee, there was also a number of squads. And they put out a number of small fires before the big fire in 1961. Okay. The other thing about Bukit Ho Swee was that it was also a progressive community. It was very progressive. It was very forward-looking, right? The people were not like people living in a backward kampong, right? The housing was bad, but the mindset of the people was actually very forward-looking. People, and why do I say this? Because you can see after the war, people in general, but also in the urban kampongs, were sending their children to school. To primary school and hopefully to secondary school and further for some of them. And an increasing number was also going to English medium schools as well. So in Bukit Ho Swee, right, you have a number of Chinese schools like Kai Kok and Chen Min. This was Chinese medium schools. And there was also for like post-primary education, what they call Gongxiong, the Chinese Industrial and Commercial School, a private school, right? And education is very important because it was a path out of the kampong and out of poverty. So I would say that Bukit Ho Swee was a progressive area because there was hope and optimism among the people. So there's a bit of research that you can do if you want. After this episode, you can look up the other urban kampongs in Singapore and try to try to find out about their histories from the library, from the newspapers. So the other thing is communities are forms of self-help, right? And the self-help that I've talked about in Bukit Ho Swee earlier, they are not new, right? The history of colonial Singapore, the society was often left on its own to fend for itself by the British government. And so the communities have to help themselves. The Chinese have got to help themselves, the Indians and the Malays likewise. So you can think about other forms of self-help that existed in colonial Singapore, like the clan associations, like the temples, the mosques, the Hindu temples. The final thing you can think about is, I think, quite interesting, how the demographics has changed so much in Singapore from the 1960s to the present day. We are no longer a city of children, right? We are a city of growing members of our community. In conclusion, right? I think this helps us to better understand the historical impact of the Bukit Ho Swee fire. So now we understand that kampongs like Bukit Ho Swee in the city were locked in a battle in the 1950s. And this battle was not between whether the area was black or white. It was not between good and evil in that sense, but between different kinds of housing. Whether you want a kampong house or you want a public house, and ultimately between autonomy and regulation, because the kampong house was not approved. They were not regulated, right? They were in fact quite illegal. Yeah. Or do you want a public form of housing that is very modern, but that's also regulated? And when you stay in a public house, you stay in a HDB flat, you have to follow certain rules and regulations. So that is one thing, right? Now, I think that if we look at the community, the optimism, the forward-looking mindset of the people, the willingness to work and work hard, right? I would say that the people in the kampong were generally ready to move into white areas. So they wanted to, right? But the housing that SIT was building was much too expensive. And they would have done so in due course, given the opportunity, right? So this is the key here. And I'll end with this. Kampong fires play a key role in creating such opportunities for people to move into public housing and into white areas. And so therefore, to say that urban kampongs were black areas was not, I think, historically correct. So thank you for listening to this podcast. Again, please subscribe to the channel and watch out for future episodes. Thank you. Bye.